Clanking, clacking, scrapes and whirs joined the soundtrack by Mira Calyx that creates the backdrop for Laura Wilson's solo exhibition, Seams, at the Centre for Contemporary Art, Derry Londonderry. I'm Catherine Hemmelreich, CCA's director, and this roundtable brings together artist Laura Wilson, writer Kerrí Ní Dochartaigh, and weaver Claire Whelan. Seams brings together 3 bodies of work from the past 5 years by Laura Wilson that each consider the movement of labour and production, including a major new work called Winding Then Winding, or Winding Then Winding, that charts not only Laura learning to weave with linen, but also her changing body during pregnancy and the daily rhythms and interruptions of the first 3 months of baby Jack's life. Laura is from Belfast originally, aka Linenopolis, and has a research-based interdisciplinary practice. This is her first exhibition in Northern Ireland, and she has exhibited across the UK and internationally, and was awarded the inaugural Jerwood New Work Fund in 2020, the Dover Prize in 2021, and is the recipient of an AN Bursary 2023. Kerrí Ní Dochartaigh was born not far from CCA and now lives on the west coast of Ireland. She's a writer known for her nature writings, and her debut book, Thin Places, published in 2021, won the Butler Literary Award and was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize. Thin Places takes us through the natural world, as well as a memoir capturing her experiences growing up during the conflicts. And her second book, Cacophony of Bone, has just been published. Claire Whelan is a weaver, designer and artist based in London. She's a studio holder at Cockpit Arts and received the Clothworks Foundation Award in July 2017. Claire uses natural materials and takes a gender-neutral approach to the colour and form of the textiles created under the brand Whelan's Weaving. She owns a number of looms, including the antique Massive Mary. Claire teaches at the School of Art and Architecture and Design in London and taught Laura how to weave in 2019. This roundtable is made possible thanks to the support of the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council and the Art Fund. Welcome, Laura, Kerry and Claire. The land and the earth play important features in all your practices. What is it about the earth that fascinates you? Perhaps starting with you, Laura, as clay and literal dirt play an important part in your work deepening.
So I suppose deepening directly is dealing with the ground. It's a work which I developed over 18 months or so, researching the archaeological site of Math Farm, which was a Bronze Age settlement that was discovered on the edge of a working brick quarry. And for me, it was quite exciting because I've been doing a lot of research previous to that on bricks. So bricks are something that I've been always very interested in because they are objects which are made from compacted ground that's from clay. The brick quarry workers dig down into the quarry and scoop up and remove these layers and layers of history and plant fibres, everything which has kind of been in this strata to make an object which is very human in scale, but then can also be used to make other things. And then for that work, the archaeologists are on site and their work wouldn't be possible without this amazing symbiotic relationship that they have with the brick quarry workers, because as the brick quarry workers are kind of digging down and revealing the earth to make the bricks, it means that the archaeologists are able to go in there and kind of discover more and more of the land and the earth. And that's revealing more information about the people that once lived there. So those people that were there in the Bronze Age. And I suppose with that work, it's very much thinking about the memories or the movements that those people that lived there once did, those kind of movements that took place on the land, but also thinking about how that's used now. So a lot kind of thinking about memory or knowledge or information, and maybe how information is passed on through those people, but also how it's stored within the ground or in the material of the earth in some way.
Kerry, thinking about the idea of memory stored in the ground, reading Thin Places and your detail of the minutiae of what was around you. Does any of this echo with you, or what is your relationship?
Lots of what Laura was saying was really drew me in. I've always been really drawn to the earth, to everything that's beneath me. So dirt, moth, bones, shit, milk, anything that we can find around our feet. And I suppose that what I'm also really drawn to, like Laura was saying, is, this idea of what gets passed on and how. So how memory is object-based, it's bone-based, it's blood-based, it's soil-based. And obviously we've got this intense history in coming from the north of Ireland. And I'm really drawn to this sense of what we pass on intergenerationally. So Thin Places explores the earth and it explores found objects, but it also looks to the impact that, there's been so much research done on how trauma works and how it ripples through ages. And I try to explore that a bit in Thin Places, and then I take it on then in my new book, Cacophony of Bone, where I really look at how Ireland, how the soil and the land and the earth and the bones and our blood and our milk as mothers, for instance, holds so much of what is in our past and what's also in our current, these crises that we're living through, and how all of that, the earth, the trees, the quality of the water, the quality of our milk or of our blood, how that can tie us finally to the past, but also pushes us forward into the future. And that's what I'm really drawn to.
I think there's so much to pick up on, and we will. But I just want to ask Claire, you use a lot of natural dyes and materials from the earth in your weaving. So what's your relationship with the earth?
My relationship with the earth is very much of a thought process of I like to be able to put back into it what I've taken and used from it. So therefore, I don't use any synthetic materials at all. Everything that I use is natural and biodegradable, either protein or cellulose, so either from an animal or from a plant. And the dye processes that I use, I don't always have complete control over, because sometimes the materials that I use in my work have been dyed by somebody else. And so that's something that I've been working on. But most dyes, unless it has an acid component, are generally okay to put back into the ground. I also think that weaving, so this is just a personal comment, is a very old skill and tradition. It's one of the oldest jobs known to man if we go back through history. And also my ancestors were linen weavers in Northern Ireland as well, and spinners, and they grew flax. So very much working on the land with the earth and then creating a material from that fibre. For me, it's more of a circular thing going on constantly over time. So what we take, is it easy to put back? Will it biodegrade? Will it become part of the earth again? And I understand that new technologies take us in different directions, particularly in textile production and the globalization of it. But one of the things that's really important to me is to only use natural materials, whether they're cellulose or protein. I don't personally have a preference. Both of them degrade at slightly different speeds, but they both add nourishment to the ground when they're placed back into it. So it's as simple as that for me, really.
Laura, in this exhibition, part of it was inspired by your personal history and your connections with the north of Ireland. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I was born and grew up in Northern Ireland, and it's been interesting. This has been my first solo show in Northern Ireland, and this was one of the most personal works that I've made. And it's kind of happened sort of by coincidence in a way. So I was able to buy a loom in 2021 because I was awarded the Dover Prize, and I contacted Claire because in the back of my mind somehow I really wanted to understand a bit more about linen. And I had done a short course with Claire in 2019 as part of the work that I was doing and the research that I was doing and the deepening, because on the archaeological site, the archaeologists discovered plant fibres which had been woven into fabric as part of the excavation. And that was something that's really, really unusual, particularly on a Bronze Age settlement. We're talking like 4,000 years ago. And the fact that that had still survived was really amazing, because it would biodegrade basically and go back into the earth, as Claire mentioned. I went to visit these pieces of fabric to look at them with the archaeologists, and the weaving, those bits of cloth are so fine and they almost look like they could be made yesterday. It's like the weaving is as sophisticated as you would be finding on your cloth on your jeans or on the shirt. So I wanted to find out more about that and understand, I suppose, that physical process of weaving and what that connection is in the body, and how you learn how to physically do those movements. Yeah, so that's why I kind of ended up doing the short weaving course with Claire, which I really at some point want to return to weaving. Linen, I suppose, is something hugely important in Northern Ireland. Belfast was known as Linopolis, and it would have employed a huge amount of the population. So I contacted Claire and I was like, would you mind mentoring me to try and learn how to weave again, and in particular weaving with linen? So that was kind of part of the process. And then simultaneously, because it was sort of during, when was it, 2021, and then it was at the Easter of that, I was sitting at home and there was all these adverts on the radio for ancestry.com, and I went into a bit of an ancestry.com poll for the whole weekend and did a lot of research into my family history and discovered that on my mum's side, similarly to Claire, that my ancestors were all linen weavers. On my mum's side, my dad's side were all farmers. So again, kind of working with the land. Yeah, weavers, warpers, growing flax. And that's something, I suppose, just in terms of like that muscle memory or that kind of idea, maybe Kerry, that you're talking about, through something that's maybe inherently in the body or knowledge that's kind of passed down through generations, that's somehow become into the work. Yeah.
Totally. I had a really interesting thing in the early part of my matrescence, like my very early becoming of motherhood, and I started it in the last trimester and then finished it in those early hazy weeks. And certain parts of it have stayed with me. So it was about weaving and what kind of fragments have been found. And it was about climate change. So it was about how that within these kind of islands, so Ireland, Scotland, those highlands and all the parts that used to be connected, I think Canada, maybe, if I remember right. But stuff that's been found can really clearly show these periods of change. And it's to do with the warp and sort of how close the fibres are together and how thick they are. And it really blew my mind, just this sense that for so long we'd been focusing in what we found in these kind of digs on what would have been viewed as very male dominated activities, and how that actually what would have been probably one of the most important things alongside keeping their children well enough to be the next part of the family unit or community unit would have been also just like the creation of things that kept the cold out. Yeah, and I don't know, it's just that sense of like you were talking about memory, and Claire was talking about when we take something from the earth, how easy is it to give it back? And actually that seems like a perfect example where the knowledge that's held within there, it's kind of like what we wear and what we choose to create. If we kind of view it as like a thread that ties us to the future, what responsibility that places in creative people's hands is very interesting for me right now. So like I've been thinking a lot recently about plants and gardening and the politics behind that. And there's this real move towards decolonizing the garden. And so I work with indigo, and just kind of reading about the background of indigo and the background of lots of other plants in general, and how we got to where we are with different plants and where they came from and what that involved is kind of interesting for me, thinking about things like printing, even the printing press and the impact that had for so long on people's lives, like people's lived reality. It's just something that kind of draws me in at the moment.
So I'm absolutely obsessed with indigo, to a point where it's kind of a bit out of control in my life, and I use it in my work. I really enjoy using it. It's an amazing dye process, and I've worked with indigo growers and people that make the dye from scratch, and also researched the history of it a little bit. And up until quite recently, I believe it was understood that indigo was travelled across the world with trade, for instance, but that's not actually the truth. Indigo dyeing now, it's been sort of documented, popped up around the world, the processes of it around the same time. So it didn't come from the east and travel across. Everybody discovered it sort of within 100-year period of one another without really realizing that it was happening. And I wonder why that was.
I love that there's a name for that theory. A guy came to take some photos of me for a paper recently, and he was telling me that he was really upset, and I was like, oh, like why? And he showed me this big massive picture, a framed photo in his car, and he was like, what do you think of this? And I said, oh, it's amazing. It was I'm not sure if you've not seen them, you wouldn't know what they are, but it was like a handball So it's just this structure, it's a concrete structure, and they pop up all around rural Ireland, and it's a place where people would have played handball outside. And they're quite iconic looking. They're very, you know, that trend that's popped up kind of around just decaying buildings or sort of brutalist structures. And he was like, oh, I've been obsessed with these for so long. And then suddenly someone else has now written a book about them, and I've been taking these photos for ages. And I was like, my partner's been obsessed with them since I first met him over a decade ago as well. And he was obsessed with them when he was younger. And that happens in art. Something pops up, and I do believe there's a reason behind it. It's like indicative of, because we're a race. Yes, we might live in all these different places and they might have different circumstances and context might be different, but we are developing in a way that spans the planet, because that's how evolution works, you know, doesn't it? And I think with art, that's such a good indication. Like, there's a reason why at the moment we're really drawn to particular things. Like, and my agent said the other day, oh, you know, mothering is the new healing narrative, you know, in books. And there's a reason for that. It's because we're at this stage in society where we're finally beginning to understand the role of caregiving. It's not a coincidence that this has come hot on the heels of something that threw us into looking at what caregiving means. You know, the pandemic and the various crises, the housing crises that are popping up, the crises of just so much, like climate crises. And so it's so interesting. The indigo one is really intriguing for me because, yeah, I'm obsessed with it too. And I'm writing about it at the moment for my next book. I'm writing about blue in general, and how, yeah, there's this association with like the maternal, the colour blue, and things like that. And it's so interesting. I'm going to say one thing and then I'll stop. But I just went to an incredible a conference in Tate St Ives, which is called Motherhood. So the M was in brackets, so various ways of mothering and childless not by choice or childless by choice, and using art as a way to explore it, springboarding from Barbara Hepworth. And there's this incredible presentation by the artist Holly Slingsby, and a series of pictures and audio as well, where she represented herself in all the different dresses and costumes that she could find for the Virgin Mary. So all of the blue Virgin Mary costumes that she could find in all their various forms. And like, I'm raised in Ireland, and I love all that iconography. And I didn't even know there was like Mary of the Garden, Mary of the Night Sky. So there's all of your things together. You've got like what we carry in our lineage, what colour carries, what fabric carries, what women carry. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking now, but I'm drawn to indigo too.
I think it's also interesting how the colour blue in general, royal through to Prussian, all of the blues, are seen in certain cultures to represent masculinity, but then also, as you've just said, are seen to represent virginity and purity. And there's such a vast sort of use for the colour globally. I don't know, I'm just absolutely obsessed.
Totally. And I think too, like, Laura, I'm thinking of you and me who are raising boys, you know, and I'm so conscious of, like, since I first had my child, really conscious of trying at every stage that I can to use a non-gendered word when I'm talking about him, and how the impact that just being more aware, being more mindful of how I discuss this person that's come along, and, you know, dressing my child kind of as gender neutral, like ensuring that they have a wide stretch of what we would view as like boy toys and girl toys, and they're just objects, aren't they? And the things that they're drawn to are, and so art, possibly specifically textile driven art, holds such power in that respect, like how we represent the world around us and how we choose colour and how we present it and how we enter into dialogue with it. Because I think, yeah, and I suppose as well, your question earlier, Catherine, about all of our relationships with earth, is like the earth holds such deep learning and deep healing in that, and how humanity has evolved in this way that boxes so much off. I suppose like the natural world teaches us that that's not the case. Like, even thinking of the symbiotic relationship between the like of lichen, fungi, moss, trees, you know, and how there's such deep connection that we're sort of hoodwinked into thinking isn't there.
Just one of the things that to pick up on that you were chatting about the importance of women, that role of, you know, Claire, you said about weaving being one of the oldest trades, or not trades, I suppose jobs, and it being something I think very connected to women, I think is really interesting, and something that I've been thinking a lot about, because I suppose it's something that can happen in the home, and it would have been probably mostly women that would have been doing it. And it was whilst I was making the work, the weaving that is, you know, this kind of 6 meter long piece that I made since Jack was born, I suppose that's something that I was thinking about a lot, and how the body is in relation to the loom, or, you know, how time is really important as well in that. And I came across, it's actually in a book, which I've forgotten the name of the writer, but I think it's called Milk, and it came out quite recently. But she writes about this statue that she was found in, it's maybe in Indonesia, but it's in a collection in a museum in, I think in Australia. But it's a bronze statue or figurine of a woman sitting, breastfeeding her child at a backstrap loom. And really, I mean, I came upon it just kind of by accident, but it was when I was sort of had started making the work, and because I was making the work and then stopping to feed Jack or change his nappy, or those kind of very kind of early days, I suppose, of motherhood, where you're kind of, I don't know, days and nights kind of all run into one. And I don't know, it just made me kind of think a lot about that, and a lot about those kind of, that physical relationship, I suppose, between...
It's Joanna Wilfarth, the writer who wrote Milk, and it's what is so mad about this conversation and about how connectedness works is that just before we came on the call, I've just been messaging with her because she's contacted. Wow. Yeah, she just contacted me about my new book, which I think would have like maybe some interest for her. And yeah, I know, because there was that piece that you're talking of was really interesting. And Rhiannon Lucy Coslett writes for The Guardian a lot on new parenthood, but with a slant for motherhood, and she's written a lot about her kind of nursing, like feeding differences and difficulties, which is something that I experienced too. And interestingly, so for both, like I think for both of us, Laura, we both have created a body of work that's come in that 4th trimester, really, like that kind of where the baby is still like very much, it just like almost like feels like it's living still inside you, and then for this body of work to come out of it. So I'm really interested in how that the creative flow between nourishing a person that you've either created or you've chosen to have in your life in that close way, and then at the same time trying to create. I'm really drawn to that, and I'm interested in how that kind of what it puts into the work, like, because I think about the fact that there have been so many times where I've been typing or I've been dictating into my phone while my son has been physically nourishing himself on my body, and I have often thought back down my lineage, but also back down like way back to our ancient ancestry, and how that worked, how different the context we're living in now is, in that you and I and others can both place that work into the world, and that's an indicator of what it means to mother and to create at the same time. And I suppose our ancestors, particularly our female ancestry, would, like, you hear so many people saying, oh yeah, I do remember my mother, like I'd come downstairs and I'd find her writing, or I'd find her knitting, or I'd find her making quilting, and we were all in bed asleep and stuff. And how much of that didn't get out into the world, and how much of that was lost. But was it really lost in an interesting way? Like, if we believe that art gives something into the world anyway, it's there somewhere, like, do you know what I mean? It's there. Like, you knew, I was so intrigued, Laura, by what you were saying, and Claire too, about how that yous are both drawn to this creative practice, this entering into this form of flow, and it's there in your bloodline, like it's in both of your bloodlines, and you knew it without knowing it. Or maybe, Claire, I'm not sure, you didn't say that you didn't know, maybe you did already know it, but just that it's there, like, and you just put your hand to it, and it's there. And I think I like to imagine how that the more and more room that's being made for women, in particular carers, so people who are caring for older people who are caring for children, either theirs or not theirs, because we all mother in our own way. And I'm really drawn to this idea that actually it's not the way we've been told. Motherhood's not how we've been told. It's not. It's so much more multi-layered. Like, I've been mothered by people who've never given birth, to an extent that I would be happy if I mothered that well my son who I did give birth to. So art mothering, the giving back that Claire spoke of. There's just so much change happening at the moment, and it's just great to see it happen in somewhere like the UK and Ireland, isn't it?
I think that one of the people in my life who's mothered me the most is a man that I'm not related to, that I met through my work, who's also a textile practitioner. He's an embroiderer. And he's mothered me in such a different way to the way that my family have. So I have 4 older sisters. So as you can imagine, I've had a lot of mothering from various female relatives. But he has mothered me in a nurturing way by understanding my work and my practice and my connection to it and my connection to my weaving practice. So, for instance, often people will ask me a technological question and my answer will be, I'm an analog hand weaver. I have no idea what you're talking about. And I process the world. I know now at 38 years of age that I process the world almost in the perspective of a hand weaver. And I'm slow, I can be methodical. I don't pay attention to everything, but the things that I pay attention to, I pay very detailed attention to. That's how I see the world. And the person that I'm talking about, his name is James. He saw all of that side of my personality in me and verified it for me, told me that it was good and highlighted the positives of how I process the world and how my practice is interlinked with that. So it's really interesting that you say that, Kerry, because I've always felt that way about James.
And that's so interesting, because when you speak of him and when you speak of how he interacts with you, the feeling I come away with is just a really safe holding, that he creates a space for you. So it's almost like that womb-like space is actually more about how we make room for the person. And that's why I was really drawn to hear about your kind of like your view on kind of like gender neutral color and stuff like that, and how you really pay attention to very particular things, but actually paying attention is the greatest form of respect and love that we can show another being, isn't it? And I think that's mothering. Like, art is mothering in a way. It's mothering the things that we choose to honor. And I think what we're living through at the moment, these various crises of which I was speaking earlier, the more we really properly stop and the more we really properly enter into communion or dialogue with those small things of which you speak, the more resilient we become, the more strong we become, the more us we become. Like, I'm talking about our own individuality, but also our animal instinct, our mammalian sense of being in the world just is totally highlighted. And I think, like, for a long time when I thought that I couldn't have a child, that's something I thought I was missing out on. Thought I was missing out on this sense of how mothering is presented as something that changes you so drastically, which it does, but in this very particular way where you're able to care in a way that you're not able to, we're told, in any other way. But that's just not true. I feel like it's so important, each of us, to carry our own story and to say that, like, I know, I really honestly, genuinely know this sounds like very, very cheesy, but I know that gardening, so sowing things in the soil, minding them, loving them, entering into what they need, for me, like, this probably sounds really, really terrible, but I do give the same amount of love to those seedlings as I give to my son. And that's okay. Like, it's totally, and in the same respect, like, I feel like I give the same amount of care to some pieces of work that really matter to me, and they might not be something that's going to bring me in loads of money, but it's something that I feel, by giving it, like you were saying, Claire, by giving it to the world, I've taken my inspiration from the world to create it, and what I want to do is kind of try and give it back. And that's, yeah, there's various forms of attention given and care, right?
It's funny, Kerry, the way that you mentioned the word there, that whenever you and Claire were talking, I was just, and it's funny that you mentioned the word gardening as well, just because I was thinking about the word tending, like to tend to something. Almost, I was just thinking about, like, I don't know, I think one of the reasons, I suppose a lot of people, maybe particularly women, like, an artist or creative practitioners, that there a certain barrier maybe to having children is that maybe that, I don't know, it's not kind of written, but like, oh, well, then you can't continue your practice, or think that has to go on the back seat, or
It often
I
is
don't know.
written. It often is written, and it's often spoken, and it's often thrown at female artists.
And something I've been thinking about a lot. But the way I was chatting, actually having a conversation with my mum yesterday about this, and the fact that I suppose both you, the way that you're kind of talking about you making space for that person to exist in a world, or for that person to be mentored, but you also have to make space, I think, within yourself. So I don't know, the way that I was kind of talking about it with my mum, and this might sound a bit strange, I suppose, is that it's kind of like another artwork, or like I'm kind of making space to tend, as you say, like to tend a garden, or it's just like another thing that you then somehow make space for within.
Yeah. I feel like we have been hoodwinked. Like, I really genuinely feel this so strongly, that we've been sold this motherhood is so glorified, but when we want to talk about the actual lived reality, like the blood and bones of it, all of what it entails, suddenly there's like just a hand comes up and it's like, oh no, we just want those lovely pictures of you breastfeeding, or that's all we want. And I think like this conference that I'm speaking of, I was at the Tates and Dives, what really struck me was that all of the pieces of work that were created in response to either motherhood, loss of a child, unborn children that one was grieving, or choosing not to have children, the way in which all of those creative people had explored that reality for them was through something in the natural world. So there was like Melanie Stidolf created this really beautiful, it was a choral piece where childless not by choice women were singing in a rock pool at dawn and dusk. So even that in itself, the rock pool as a container of the grief. And then there was this exquisite, so a woman who'd lost her son when he was a teenager, had scattered his ashes into the water and had taken these microscopic pictures that looked like kind of like mini moons of him. And she talked of how this piece that she'd produced had become an icon of her love for him and their continued existence, and how that the natural world and the art had created a space. It just was all about the creation of space. And I looked at the garden, and Jodie Day, who's the founder of Gateway Women, which is an incredible organisation that support families through childlessness not by choice, looked at hagstones. So literally like a stone with a holding space inside. And of course, Barbara Hepworth, when she lost her son Paul, you know, how she used her artwork to really create that space in her life, which was really busy. And she had 2 other children that she was still caring for. She was a sole provider, but how that for art did need to be created, but it also was a space that needed to be created, and how that when we step into any role that holds so much responsibility and that changes us incomparably, we're almost told, society expects things to just go back to normal. Like, you get your checkup, you're told, okay, right, back at it, back to work at this age, blah 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 blah. But it's not women's lived, it's not caregivers' lived realities, especially artistic and creative ones. And yeah, I think it's so good that spaces like this exist, and others where we can kind of look at these things that we're all, like Claire was saying about the indigo, we're all drawn to particular things at particular times, and there's a reason for it.
Something that has been very nice about the exhibition by Laura at CCA has been the presence of baby Jack's baby blanket. So Jack's not only present in the show through the woven piece that charts the daily rhythms of your life, Laura, and upon the arrival of Jack, but also through this blanket, which will return to him as well, because it's his blanket. But I'm sort of at the other end of things. I recently lost my mother, and those things that have become so important, like the crochet blanket she made, that were just part of our environment, and those things where you just sort of physically envelop even after she's not here anymore. And sort of the ancestors before, just all of my grandmothers, my great-grandmothers, my great-great-great-grandmothers, everybody was making cross stitch or sewing toys, or all of these things that have just either perished through serious use or have managed to make it down, and they've just become part of our everyday fabric. Time and going forwards and backwards, I think something interesting both in your books, Kerrí, where in Thin Places we're in one time zone and then we're looking back, and also Laura, with yours we're looking back at the very ancient pots that are now here, that are now given to the future generations. So I wonder if there's some more you'd like to muse on that.
I suppose one of the things, because sort of in deepening, there's the visual imagery of using the vessels in the film, and there's a moment where they're kind of being passed across, the hands from one person to another. And in the film, To the Wind's Teeth, which it was a performance that was then filmed in a threshing barn in Wales. And both of those, I suppose those things, and weaving as well, those kind of like learned actions, but particularly I suppose with the vessels, I see them as these kind of, I don't know, they look almost like they could have been made yesterday. And maybe it's also, as I mentioned earlier, with these bits of fabric, but the contemporariness of it and the fact that these are things that would have been happening, I don't know, through kind of generations too.
Catherine, I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that with us so tenderly. There is something so interesting that happens at these turning points, these liminal points in our life, where we experience loss of something that's been there since our beginning, or it has been the point of our beginning. And there is also something so primal that can happen at the creative point where that happens too. So that turning point where we stop, where we're given permission to really enter into dialogue with where we've come from and who we are and where we're going. And I hope that that is fruitful for you. But what you were saying, Laura, about a sense of like, again, it's like containers, isn't it? It's like this sense of a container in which we place our creative flow, or in which we're held and we kind of have to spill out over from. And I suppose that what I'm always really conscious of with my creative practice is like, am I putting what I do in the right place? I know it sounds really silly, but whether that looks like, is this supposed to be a book, or is this just meant to be like a diary journal that I don't publish? Is this film supposed to be shared, or this idea is supposed to be shared, or does it live in me? So I suppose there's that question of legacy, and feel like coming from Derry, where legacy, we're coming from the north in general, where legacy is such an important thing, an important dialogue that's happening right now. What we leave behind, what we pass on, and the ripples that creates, and how they look in time. So like I'm just at the moment, I'm writing an introduction for one of Tim Robinson's books, the British cartographer who made the west of Ireland his home. So he's a really interesting person in that, like Claire was saying, one of his famous phrases is that, like, so he gave everything that he'd created to the University of Galway when he died. So he said he arrived in the west of Ireland with nothing, and he wanted to leave with nothing. So like even his ashes went into Roundstone, into the water at Roundstone. And I love that that's how he interacted with a landscape that has so much been about ownership. So Ireland has been so impacted on by colonial violence, by colonial ownership, and how that as an English man, as an English white man, when he arrived, he knew how important this was for his interaction with the land around him, that he knew he had to view it as totally on the same level, he and the land together. And like, the more I think about how we're moving in Ireland specifically, maybe in the UK as well, like with kind of river issues and who owns them and what can go into rivers and who can go into rivers, and the impact of swimming in a river. And the same here, like in Ireland, where there's just constantly fighting about extraction, like the Strabane Mountains, and what's being taken out of the land and what's being put into the sea. We're at this point where our decisions ripple so vastly. We're in this part of the Anthropocene where, as human beings, we are having the most impact on the environment that we've ever had. So our responsibility levels have gone right up, but those in responsibility have the least understanding of the land. So the people that know the land best, so Indigenous people, older elders who know the land so well, like the healing nature of plants, or when not to go out because it's going to bucket down with rain, those people are the most silenced at the moment, and the people who have the greatest voice are the people that are the most disconnected from the land. I feel like we're in this funny transitional period where we need to shift all that and somehow get back to women's knowledge, and to like elder women's knowledge, like crone knowledge, and what will be lost if we don't address the fact that knowledge of the land is held in us, it's held in our bones, it's held in our DNA, it's held in our stories, in our songs, in our fabric.
Claire, do you feel that this is something that's becoming increasingly important in your area of textiles? From the outsider perspective, it feels like it's something that's been growing and growing, but at the same time, fast fashion and all of these things also seem to be not going away.
I think something about weaving compared to other textile construction or decoration techniques is that it's classified as a craft. And a lot of textile techniques aren't, for instance, that are used in fast fashion and in interiors. We also now live in an age where having a trendy home is really important, and updating our carpets constantly and our artwork and putting that out into the world and having the best linen bedsheet sort of makes me think of my parents and my upbringing. So I'm English, but raised by an Irish and a Northern Irish parent. And so my childhood was very different to a lot of my peers in a sense of we did have a lot of, I'm the youngest of 6 children. I had a lot of clothing that my sister had, that my mum knitted or made for my sister 20 years previously to me being born, that was passed down, and that maybe my mother had worn as a child and was passed down through our family. So I personally have a lot of connection to fabric and textiles and the memory of it, and having the same bed sheets for the whole 18 years that I lived with my parents. And, you know, I remember my sister, she went and lived in the Gambia, and she used to come back with the most amazing sort of hand printed and tie-dyed textiles. And I would have been 6 or 7 at the time. And even the memory I have of receiving those fabrics from my sister from this exotic, magical place that I'd never been to, I'd only seen photographs of on the other side of the world. Even the memory I have of that, let alone the textiles, which I still own some of, is very precious to me because it was a gift. Maybe that was my first signal that I was absolutely obsessed with fabric, but it was such an amazing gift for me to receive a part of a life that she had that I couldn't be involved in, if that makes sense. And I think also I feel that way about clothing and fabrics that have been passed down through my family, through my siblings, from my mother's childhood, less so from my father's. There's a comfort that I find. And also, Catherine, I lost a parent last year, and I have decided to make a quilt out of all of my father's clothing. So I've been going through his clothing and looking and pulled out basically all the blue items and realized maybe my obsession is, you know, seeping into other areas of my life. And it's really interesting because I was very thoughtful about asking my siblings how they felt about me taking all of those items to create that quilt. And just none of them were bothered. None of them had the same connection to the fabrics that I had. You know, when my father passed, he was wearing a pair of socks that were brand new. We hadn't opened them. Everyone used to buy him socks. I don't know about you guys and the men in your lives, but they just get a huge amount of socks for Christmas and birthdays that they never open or wear. So we'd taken this pair of socks, and they were Christmas socks, so that we could hold some compact relief presses on his feet for comfort. And I was with him the whole week until he passed, but I wasn't there the evening that he did. And my sister immediately took the socks, put them to one side, sent me a message and said, I've kept these socks for you. And she didn't say that to any of my siblings. She just immediately said it to me. So perhaps I hold more comfort in fabric than the average person or the average person in my family. But yes, I'm massively involved in holding on to fabric and the memories of where I found it, what I was doing at the time, and the way that it made me feel. I also have an inability to not touch fabric. I have to get my hands all over it immediately. And that's another sense that I have a memory of. So it's all intertwined for me, all of those, the comfort, the tactility, the memories, and the repurposing of fabric. I think that's a really important thing that we don't do enough nowadays. And also I understand that as somebody that is a hand weaver, I understand the amount of hours that go into A, producing a fibre, B, turning it into a yarn, C, then dyeing it or whatever process you want to take it through, then turning it into a cloth, then finishing it, then turning it into a product. There's a lot of stages involved that most people don't really understand. So I'll give you one example of fast fashion. I always say to my students, because I teach weaving at a university, I always say to them, have you ever bought a t-shirt? I won't name any high street brands, but there's one in particular that I do normally name. And when you've washed it, the seam has distorted. So we've all bought an item of clothing where when we've washed it, the seam has distorted. And that is because a whole massive process, which is the finishing process, which can be done chemically or through washing, either at high temperatures or with friction, has been missed out because it saves millions and millions of pounds. So that fabric comes what we call loom state off the knitting machine or the loom straight into production of a product. And the same care isn't given because of a cost saving reason. So there's just so many steps and processes involved that I'm now aware of, which is maybe why I feel very precious about fabric, I guess is the long way of me saying that.
I think, Claire, over like the last, however, like almost about 18 months or so, we've had lots of conversations about fabric, and through the kind of through me learning the different processes from you, I've learned lots about how the yarns behave, and particularly I think one of the things that really I find so surprising is how much when we washed some of the fabric that came off the loom, how much it actually shrunk, like by almost, an inch at least, if not a little bit more. And yeah, just to go back also to thinking about, when you mentioned the blanket, Catherine, and that being in the office, and the work that I've been making is looking at linen. And Kerry, you mentioned about showing things, that what you choose to show and what you choose not to show, or reveal or not reveal, is something that I was thinking a lot about the blanket, because Claire, that was whenever I think I told you that I was pregnant, you were like, oh, well, maybe you should try making a baby blanket. And in a way, I think I've been concentrating so much on, learning the techniques in linen, which were so important to me. But then also this kind of change in material, working in a material, because I made it with wool, because blankets wouldn't be made out of linen. And that idea of like care that goes into it, and that different type of material, I find quite interesting. But yeah, I was just kind of thinking about all of those things together, and I wasn't sure, I suppose, and I think I had conversations with you, Catherine, and probably with Claire too, with you. I was like, yeah, do I show the blanket as part of the, and then that choice to have it in the office as that, that it could be there for a member of staff. If you do feel cold, you can wear it. And also this idea of, as being kind of like a covering on the body, or to kind of offering a bit of comfort, but that it can be this thing that will be returned to Jack at some point too. But I don't know, just all of those things I was kind of thinking about. And it's really nice, Catherine, like that idea of the blanket that you had from your mum's as well. And I can't wait to see the quilt, Claire, that you're talking about. Sounds amazing.
I think that's a really beautiful point to end our conversation today, even though there's so much more to talk about. So thank you all so much for your time, Kerrí Ní Dochartaigh, Claire Whelan and Laura Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
To find out more about seams and other CCA roundtables, you can visit ccadld.org, as well as visiting our Spotify channel and YouTube channel. And we're at CCA DLD across all the socials. Thank you for listening.